Just after 7:17 a.m. on the 30th of June, 1908, an immense explosion shook the skies above central Siberia. The blast occurred north of Lake Baikal, near the stony Tunguska River, about 3,500 kilometers east of Moscow, and was later estimated to be anywhere from 10 to 40 megatons in size, at least 1,000 times the force of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. An area of wilderness larger than Washington, D.C. was obliterated in a massive fireball. Millions of pine and cedar trees turned into bare telegraph poles in an instant. 30 kilometers from Ground Zero, an Evenki herdsman named Ivan and his wife Akolina awoke to a scene of utter chaos. Quote, "A mighty wind flattened our tent. A brilliant outburst of light blinded us. The wind was breaking trees like they were sticks. As a rising whirlwind lifted us off the ground, I lost consciousness." Unquote. Before passing out, Akolina recalled her husband unceremoniously blown over 30 meters into one of the few remaining upright trees. In the trading post of Vanavara, 70 kilometers distant, farmer Sergei Semenov ate breakfast on the porch of his hut and watched a black mushroom cloud of dust and dirt climb into the thermosphere. A few moments later, he was blown off his chair by a tremendous blast of searing hot wind. The village of Kayevskoy reported explosions lasting for several minutes. One villager interviewed during a later expedition to the site stated, quote, "A ball of fire came down obliquely. A few minutes later we heard a deafening crash like peals of thunder, followed by 8 loud bangs like gunshots." Unquote. Other witnesses in other villages reported damage to buildings, intense light and heat, tales of panic-stricken locals who were convinced the world was coming to an end. An engineer on the Trans-Siberian Railway stopped his locomotive outside the city of Kansk when he heard an explosion so loud he was certain one of the freight cars had blown up. Ignorant of the initial event, seismologists as far away as St. Petersburg and Washington State recorded a ground tremor. Sensitive barometers detected a pressure wave that would eventually circle the Earth twice. Still further away, the London Times printed a letter from Miss Catherine Stephan about a strange glow in the sky that she and her sister witnessed just after midnight on July 1st. All around the globe, people knew something incredible had happened, but few connected the seismic and barometric readings with the eyewitness testimony. Similar readings had been made after the infamous eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, but where the volcano had produced one set of pressure waves, the Tunguska event had produced waves of 2 distinct types. The first as some unknown object entered the atmosphere, and the second upon its detonation. The immediate presumption was that the remote Siberian wilderness had been the victim of a meteor impact. A notable example of an impact site is the Barringer crater in Arizona, made by the impact of a 50-meter-wide metallic meteorite traveling over 40,000 kilometers per hour. Generally, only meteors made of metal have enough mass to reach the ground, and therefore impact craters can be a source of commercially useful elements, particularly metallic iron, which is somewhat rare on Earth. The suggestion of a downed meteor in Siberia piqued the economic interest of the fledgling Soviet Union, as it did with many governments in the early 20th century. In February of 1927, the Soviet Academy of Sciences approved an expedition to the impact site. Led by a mineralogist and meteorite enthusiast named Leonid Kulik, the first Tunguska expedition left Leningrad, eventually reaching Vanavara, where the blast wave had violently interrupted the breakfast of Mr. Semenov many years before. Though urged not to continue into the forbidden lands of the Thunder God, whom the native Evenki presumed to have caused the blast, Kulik, his assistant, and their reluctant Evenki guides pressed on through uncivilized taiga, battling swarms of ravenous mosquitoes nicknamed flying alligators, and chopping through nearly impassable brush. On the 15th of April, Kulik climbed to the top of a small mountain and stared dumbfounded at the sight beyond. An immense plateau was covered by fallen trees that had been stripped of branches and neatly aligned. Stated Kulik, quote, "One has an uncanny feeling when one sees giant trees snapped across like twigs and their tops hurled many meters away to the south." Unquote. Over the following month, the expedition crossed the plateau. When they reached the epicenter, they were astonished to find only a grove of branchless trees standing upright where there should have been a sizable crater. Kulik also noted the ground had been molded into a series of shallow, concentric ridges, as if the earth itself had momentarily flowed like the rippling surface of a pond. More bizarrely, upon surveying the plateau, it was determined the area of destruction was shaped in an asymmetrical, butterfly-like pattern instead of something more circular, as common sense would suggest. In 1959, Soviet professor of geophysics Alexei Zolotov estimated the size of the Tunguska object at no less than 40 meters in diameter and at least 1 million tons, moving at nearly 110,000 kilometers per hour at the time of detonation. This estimation made the meteor hypothesis more compelling, yet made the lack of tangible evidence even more baffling. Why wasn't there an impact crater? Why were the trees at the center of the blast zone still standing when the vast majority of them had been flattened? And what would account for the oddly shaped area of destruction? In an effort to answer some of these questions, the Soviet Union performed an experiment in the mid-1960s in which a model of the Siberian forest was constructed from a grid of thousands of matchsticks. Small explosives were detonated over the grid at various elevations and angles, and the results compared to observations made in the field. A blast pattern very similar in shape to the Tunguska site was eventually produced, offering a credible explanation as to why no crater was ever found, and why concentric ripples and the out-of-place standing trees were observed. The butterfly shape could be explained if the object had followed a very oblique trajectory, a point consistent with many eyewitness statements. The spherical shape of an expanding shock bubble would mean any trees directly underneath would be hit by a downward force rather than by the lateral one that washed over the rest of the plateau. That same downward force could also have produced the ripples in the earth, as heat and pressure softened the ground and shaped it before it cooled and hardened into its original consistency. Whatever came down over Tunguska had apparently exploded 3 or 4 kilometers above the surface, and at a shallow angle of about 30 degrees to the ground. One question still lingered, however. If a 1,000,000-ton meteor had entered the atmosphere and exploded, where was the debris? Certainly an airburst of that size would shower rubble over hundreds of square kilometers. The first serious alternative explanation for the meteor had actually been made years before, in 1930, by meteorologist Francis Whipple. To account for Kulik's inability to find a crater, Whipple had suggested the object in question was more likely a small comet comprised of volatile compounds, such as water ice and frozen gas, rather than a more conventional meteor made of iron and nickel. A comet would evaporate much more readily than a stony or metallic meteor, and thus not leave a crater, and the resulting flash of evaporating gases would easily account for the glowing skies reported across the globe at the time. In 1978, astronomer Lubor Krezek went further and suggested the Tunguska event was specifically caused by a fragment of Comet Encke, a particularly short-period comet responsible for an annual meteor shower that coincided with the initial event's date. The comet hypothesis was eventually dealt a mighty blow in 1983, however, when astronomer Zdeněk Zekanina pointed out that a comet traveling at such a shallow angle would neither be dense nor stable enough to remain intact so deep into the atmosphere. Zekanina argued the object was likely a large stony meteor, possibly originating in the asteroid belt. A large stone would likely be able to make it most of the way to the surface, but the relatively low density would make it unable to overcome the tremendous mounting pressure at its leading edge. The resultant energetic buildup would cause the stone to explode, as if squeezed in a giant pneumatic press. The absence of debris also fit well with this explanation. Non-metallic stones from space look and feel very much like stones from Earth. Neither Kulik nor any of his successors would be able to tell meteorites from meteorons. The comet and meteor theories haven't convinced everyone, however. Since Kulik's first expedition into the wilderness, creative explanations for the blast, ranging from the innovative to the downright weird, have been put forth. In 1973, theoretical physicists Michael P. Ryan and Albert A. Jackson offered a radical solution to the Tunguska mystery. Inspired by the work of Stephen Hawking, they postulated that a miniature black hole, something perhaps only a micrometer in diameter, collided with the Earth. Creating enough atmospheric turbulence to blow down a forest, the black hole would generate a burst of ultraviolet radiation as it passed, appearing as a blue flash of light, something many of the Evenki witnesses had reported seeing just before the explosion. A black hole would also leave no detectable crater and leave the ground slightly deformed, as the surface rock was too rigid to allow the gravitational shock waves to easily pass. Unfortunately, the idea of a miniature black hole seems unlikely when considering other events, or lack thereof, afterward. A black hole, even when as small as suggested by Ryan and Jackson, would pass through the Earth totally unimpeded, exiting somewhere in the North Atlantic in a matter of minutes. The absence of such a secondary event would seem only to compound one mystery with another. In 1941, University of New Mexico astronomer Lincoln La Paz proposed the unorthodox theory that what had fallen at Tunguska was neither comet nor meteor, but a piece of antimatter, a material in which all the constituent particles are of opposite charge to the more conventional type. La Paz argued that because matter and antimatter simply annihilate each other when they are brought into contact, the tremendous release of energy in the form of heat and visible light, the absence of impact crater, and the paucity of nickel-iron debris could all be accounted for. Harvey Nininger, president of the American Society for Research on Meteorites, was quick to criticize La Paz, suggesting he was, quote, courting a return to the days of spirits and mystery, unquote. The unusually reactive nature of a chunk of antimatter would certainly make one wonder how it traveled through space all the way to Earth without bumping into anything else along the way. For at least 2 centuries, people have given strikingly detailed accounts of balls of lightning flying through houses and passing through materials such as glass and wood. In 2002, one such account printed in the journal Philosophical Transactions described an encounter by a resident in Johannesburg. Quote, "It entered the kitchen around the corner, then sped out of the kitchen again, where it hit a tin bucket with a clang. When we ran to check, the bucket was too hot to handle, and its paint had blistered." Unquote. Another notable example in the same journal described a lightning ball over half a meter in diameter bouncing off the head of a Russian teacher as she was speaking to friends. As bizarre as it sounds, ball lightning has been the topic of serious scientific scrutiny for some time. Though no theory has been yet widely accepted, the most popular explanation is that ball lightning is plasma that has somehow managed to remain cohesive. Given the right conditions, a ball could become huge in a very short period of time. Physicist Gigi Kashemesov estimates the necessary diameter for the ball in question would have to be about 200 meters. Though no ball of lightning of that size has ever been seen, Kashemesov cites one ancient Indian epic that speaks of explosions that cause dazzling light and a fire without smoke. In 1975, geophysicist Alexei Zolotov, who calculated the size and the force of the blast years earlier, stated his belief that the Tunguska event was of nuclear in nature and intelligent in origin. Moreover, he claimed that the explosion was deliberate. Zolotov suggested the UFO had entered Earth's atmosphere and navigated using Lake Baikal as a point of reference, targeting an area of the planet with no human inhabitants. In his words, the area of devastation was, quote, an amazing demonstration of pinpoint accuracy and humanitarianism, unquote. A wayward extraterrestrial UFO blowing up over Tunguska seems directly out of the realm of Z-grade science fiction, yet there is reason to at least entertain the idea. Several hundred eyewitnesses of the thousands interviewed claimed that the object that passed overhead had changed direction. Some even claimed it had changed course many times. No other explanation offered could satisfactorily account for such behavior if accurate, except for perhaps ball lightning, which has often been described as moving erratically. Unfortunately for Zolotov, careful scrutiny of the eyewitness reports has since shown that all the direction change observations were either contradictory or too vague to be useful. Strangely, soil and plant samples collected from within the center of the blast zone showed levels of radiation as much as twice as high as samples taken 30 to 40 kilometers out. Doubly strange, the Irkutsk Magnetic and Meteorological Observatory recorded a magnetic storm soon after the initial explosion that lasted for 4 hours. Such storms have never been associated with meteorites, but they are commonly observed after nuclear bomb tests. University of Bonn professor of astrophysics Wolfgang Kundt thinks a decidedly more terrestrial event is the likely scenario. The Tunguska site lies in the middle of a 250 million year old volcanic crater, crisscrossed by several fractures that run through the various layers of rock, creating a series of deep volcanic vents. Kundt believes copious amounts of methane gas may have escaped from these vents at great velocity, becoming electrically charged as it mixed with the air. Eventually, the volatile mixture was ignited, perhaps by a spark of lightning, and turned much of the sky above Siberia into a massive fireball, much like the thermobaric weapons stocked by some of the world's militaries. Also noted by Kundt is an apparent discrepancy regarding the trees in the area. Small islands of upright trees have been noted across the plateau, not just the main group in the center. Also, instead of being perfectly straight, the radial pattern of downed tree trunks meanders slightly. Both of these features suggest a cluster of explosive events, an idea echoed in the conclusions of an Italian expedition made in 1991. In reference to witness testimony, Kundt also pointed out many people heard gunshots before they saw a pillar of fire in the sky. Could this have been caused by the initial set of methane explosions? Kundt's theory is somewhat convincing until witness testimony is considered further. The methane ignition idea simply has nothing to say regarding a passing fireball. A vast majority of people within 200 or 300 kilometers of ground zero reported seeing a fireball rocket through the sky beforehand. In fact, far more witnesses reported a passing fireball than a series of gunshot-like sounds. Probability would suggest the former is more noteworthy, and thus more pertinent to the mystery. So what exactly was it that villagers reported streaking through the sky in 1908? A comet or meteor seems to be the most likely candidate. Such a prosaic explanation removes some of the enigmatic luster from the Tunguska event, but whether or not a comet, meteor, errant UFO, or black hole was ultimately responsible, two disturbing implications should be considered. First, if whatever came down in Siberia had instead fallen into a densely populated area, the result would have undoubtedly been one of the largest natural disasters in history, with a death toll possibly in the millions. And second, neither reindeer herders, nor farmers, nor train engineers, nor scientists had the slightest idea regarding what was about to transpire that June morning. In fact, no one on Earth had the slightest idea, and no one today would either.